Lizzie is a scentless ghost in a world where scent is soul, and alpha pressure can crush a warrior's spirit. While others choke on the High King's dominant presence, she sees only a massive, shirtless man hauling a water trough through a screaming blizzard. Mistaking the apex of the Seven Territories for a common servant, she flicks him a silver coin with a blunt command. "Clean my horse!" That single coin ignites a binding silver contract and a dangerous obsession. As the lethal feral plague spreads, the king who was never looked in the eye finds himself enslaved to a woman who doesn't even know how to bow. But Lizzie's broken nature hides a pearlescent light that will either save the kingdom or burn it to the ground. Welcome back to Atlena's Romantasy Collection. I am so happy to have our longtime listeners back with us, and a warm welcome to all the new faces joining our pack today for this epic journey. Before we dive into the blizzard, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Hit that notification bell icon so you never miss a chapter of this story. Our community is growing across the globe, and I want to hear from you. Where are you listening from today? Tell me your location in the comments below. Chapter 1. The Silver Tip. The blizzard in the Cairn Highlands didn't just fall, it screamed. It was a sensory assault of ice and wind that would have brought a lesser wolf to their knees. Elizabeth, known to everyone as Lizzie, clutched the reins of her mare, Ironhoof, her fingers frozen into stiff claws. She couldn't smell the oncoming storm or the pine needles of the valley. To Lizzie, the world was a silent, scentless landscape defined only by what she could touch and see. Her nose blindness was blamed on a childhood forge accident, a convenient lie for a girl whose true nature had to remain hidden. But tonight, as she cleared the heavy iron portcullis of the Frosthook outpost, it was her greatest armor. The courtyard was eerily quiet. Most wolves were huddled indoors, paralyzed by the overwhelming alpha pressure that saturated the air. The king's presence here was a physical weight, a scent so dominant it made lesser shifters choke on their own tongues. Lizzie felt nothing but the cold. She spotted a massive silhouette near the stables. The man was a mountain of muscle, shirtless despite the freezing sleet, his back a map of jagged war scars. He was hauling a heavy iron water trough as if it were a feather. "You, stable hand!" Lizzie barked, sliding off her horse. Her boots hit the frozen slush with a wet thud. The man froze. He didn't turn immediately. A low, rhythmic vibration began to hum in the air, a growl so deep it was felt in the marrow rather than heard. "Don't you dare growl at me, I've had a hell of a day," Lizzie snapped, marching toward him. Up close, he was even more intimidating. His skin radiated a strange, fierce heat. "My mare has a stone in her rear left hoof and she's shivering. I need her rubbed down, fed, and blanketed. Now!" The man turned slowly. His eyes were the color of a winter sky, piercing, ancient, and utterly stunned. No one had spoken to him without trembling in 3 centuries. Lizzie didn't bow. She didn't blink. She reached into her belt pouch, pulled out a heavy silver mark, a coin she had minted herself, stamped with the secret dying crest of her exiled house, and flicked it at his chest. It hit his rock-hard pectoral with a sharp clink. He caught it in midair with a reflex so fast it was predatory. "There's your payment," Lizzie said, pointing a dirty finger at his face. "Do a good job and I'll find another for you in the morning. And put a tunic on. Showing off your muscles in a blizzard is distracting and unprofessional. Move it!" She turned on her heel and marched toward the inlight, leaving High King Torsten, the apex of the Seven Territories, standing in the mud, staring at a piece of silver and the back of a woman who had just treated him like a dim-witted servant. Torsten looked at the coin, his thumb tracing the smithy mark. A dark, dangerous amusement flickered in his chest. For the first time in his life, someone had looked him in the eye and seen a man, not a god. He looked at the mare, who huffed a cloud of steam into his face. "A stone in the hoof," he murmured, his voice like grinding stones. "And I'm unprofessional." He picked up a stiff brush. He, the man who commanded armies, began to work. If she wanted a stable hand, he would give her the best grooming her horse had ever had. Chapter 2. The Silent Service. Torsten worked in the dim, flickering light of a single witch lamp. His beta, Bramwell, emerged from the shadows of the stone archway, his face a mask of horror. "Majesty!" Bramwell hissed, dropping to one knee in the muck. "What are you doing? Let me take that brush. The woman is clearly mad. I will find her and ensure she never speaks again." "Stay where you are, Bramwell," Torsten commanded without looking up. The weight of his voice made the beta flinch. "She paid me. A contract in silver is a binding thing in our lands, is it not?" "But she poked you. She poked the apex." Torsten's eyes flashed gold in the dark. "She has no scent, Bramwell. No fear, no submission, no aggression. She is a ghost. I want to know why. I want to know how a tiny thing like that can walk through my aura without her heart stopping." He spent an hour meticulously grooming the mare. He checked every hoof, removed the stone, and even oiled the leather of the saddle. He found himself strangely calmed by the labor. For a moment, the crown didn't weigh so heavily. He was just a man, doing a job for a silver coin. "Grendel!" Torsten called out. The actual stablemaster scrambled down from the loft, shaking so hard his teeth rattled. "Tell no one of this. If she asks, I am a laborer named Tor. If you speak a word of my title to her, I will feed you to the winter whites." "Yes, my king. Of course, my king." The next morning, the sun rose over the peaks like a bruised plum. Lizzie woke up on a straw mattress, her mind already racing with ledgers and deliveries. She had a shipment of refined silver to get to the southern border. She dressed in her rugged leathers, buckled her smithing hammers to her thigh, and headed to the Great Hall to secure a travel permit. The hall was stifling. Usually, these outposts were rowdy, but today the silence was heavy. Wolves were huddled against the walls, their heads bowed. Lizzie pushed through the crowd. "Move it, you lot! Some of us have work to do," she muttered, elbowing a massive warrior out of her path. At the end of the hall, on a throne of dark oak, sat the man from the stables. He was no longer shirtless. He was draped in charcoal furs and black steel, a heavy gold circlet resting on his brow. Lizzie stopped. She didn't gasp. She didn't kneel. She narrowed her eyes. "You," she said, her voice echoing in the silent hall. "Where's my horse? I told you dawn, and it's past first light. And don't think just because you found some fancy clothes that you're off the clock. Did you braid her mane? I told you no braids." The entire room seemed to stop breathing. Bramwell drew his sword half an inch, his knuckles white. "You dare? Kneel, rogue, before your tongue is harvested." Lizzie didn't even look at Bramwell. She kept her eyes locked on Torsten. "I don't know who Majesty is, but I know a silver mark buys a hoof check. Is the horse ready, or do I need to talk to your supervisor?" Torsten leaned forward, a slow, predatory smirk spreading across his face. He held up the silver coin she had given him. "My supervisor is unavailable, and the horse is ready, but you, little smith, have committed a crime. You have hired the crown. That debt cannot be paid in coin." Chapter 3. The King's Ransom. The tension in the Great Hall was thick enough to choke on. 100 hardened warriors waited for the word to execute the woman who had just insulted their sovereign. Lizzie, however, simply crossed her arms and tapped her boot against the stone floor. "A crime?" Lizzie scoffed. "If doing a job you were paid for is a crime, your legal system is as messy as your hair. I didn't hire the crown. I hired a man with big shoulders who looked like he knew how to use a brush. If you're the king, that's your problem, not mine." Torsten stood up, his massive frame casting a long shadow over the dais. He descended the stairs slowly, his boots clicking with terrifying precision. He stopped mere inches from her. Most people would have fainted from the proximity to his power. Lizzie just looked up at him, her expression one of mild annoyance. "You stole my time," Torsten said, his voice a low, intimate rumble. "The time of the apex is worth more than all the silver in your pouch. By the laws of the Highlands, when a king performs a service for a commoner, that commoner becomes indentured until the value is repaid." "I have a business to run," Lizzie countered, not moving an inch. "I have shipments of moonglass silver that the southern healers need for the plague. I don't have time to be indentured to a brooding wolf who spends his mornings playing dress-up." Torsten's eyes flared. "The plague? You're the one providing the silver for the medicines? I'm the only smith in 3 provinces who can refine it without cracking the grain, she said proudly. So, unless you want your people turning into feral monsters, I suggest you give me my horse and my travel pass. Torsten looked at his beta, Bramwell, who was still trembling with rage. Then he looked back at the fierce, scent-blind woman before him. He saw the logic, but he also saw an opportunity. For years, he had been looking for a scout who could enter the feral zones, areas so saturated with the scent of madness that no wolf could survive the aura. I will give you your pass, Torsten said, his voice ringing through the hall. But only if you serve as my personal outrider. You will lead us into the feral zones. You will be my eyes where mine fail. Do this, and your debt is cleared. Refuse, and I impound your silver and your horse. Lizzie's jaw tightened. She hated being backed into a corner, but she knew she couldn't outrun a king's decree. A month, she said, pointing a finger at his chest. I give you 4 weeks, and I'm in charge of the campfire. I've seen your stable hand work. I don't trust you not to burn the beans. A collective gasp went up from the court. Torsten laughed, a genuine, booming sound that shook the rafters. Deal, Torsten said. Bramwell, prepare the horses. We head north at noon, and get the lady a proper cloak. I won't have my outrider freezing to death before we hit the tree line. Lizzie turned to leave, but stopped and looked back. And Torsten, if you touch my horse's mane again, I'm charging you extra. Chapter 4. The Scentless Road. The departure from the Frosthook outpost was a grim affair. The wind had died down, replaced by a biting, heavy fog that clung to the coats of the horses. Torsten led the line, his black stallion, Midnight, dwarfing the other mounts. Beside him rode Lizzie on Ironhoof, her smithing tools clinking rhythmically against her thigh. Behind them followed Bramwell and 4 elite Void Guard, warriors trained to resist the madness of the plague. They were all silent, their faces hidden behind steel visors. You're doing it again, Lizzie said, breaking the silence after 2 hours of riding. Torsten glanced at her. Doing what? Brooding. It makes your forehead wrinkle. You'll look like a shriveled apple by the time we reach the next village, she noted, her voice flat and bored. I am contemplating the reports, Lizzie, Torsten replied, trying to maintain his royal dignity. The feral are spreading. Entire packs are losing their minds. It isn't just a fever, it's a corruption of the soul. The scent of it. It's like rotting meat and burning hair. It drives wolves into a killing frenzy. Doesn't sound much worse than a tavern brawl on a Saturday night, Lizzie shrugged. That is because you cannot smell the fear, Bramwell snapped from behind. You ride beside a king as if you are his equal, but you are a broken thing. You have no idea the horror we face. Lizzie pulled Ironhoof to a stop and turned in her saddle. Listen here, you walking tin can. I might be scent blind, but that means I don't get distracted by who's the alpha and who's the omega. I see the world as it is. While you're busy sniffing the air and shaking in your boots, I'm the one who's going to see the tripwire or the wolf in the shadows. So stop calling me broken, or I'll use my hammer to fix that dent in your head. Bramwell's face turned a deep shade of purple, but a sharp look from Torsten silenced him. She has a point, Bramwell, Torsten said, his eyes fixed on Lizzie with growing fascination. Her lack of scent sense is exactly why she is here. She is immune to the biological terror the feral emit. They reached a small waypoint village tucked into a gray stone valley. The atmosphere was desolate. Doors were barred with heavy iron, and no children played in the streets. As they approached the communal well, Lizzie saw a young woman struggling with a massive bucket of water. The girl looked exhausted, her hair a bird's nest of straw. Lizzie hopped off her horse. Give it here, she said, grabbing the handle before the girl could protest. I can do it, the girl whispered, her eyes wide with terror as she looked at the king's guards. You're going to pop a joint, Lizzie muttered, hoisting the bucket with practiced ease. I'm Lizzie. I'm the king's outrider, which is just a fancy way of saying I'm the only one who tells him he's being a brat. Who are you? Kiva, the girl said, a small, startled laugh escaping her lips. I'm the village dormant. No wolf, no scent, They don't let me into the Great Hall. Lizzie paused, looking at Kiva with a rare surge of kinship. No wolf? So you don't feel the alpha pressure either? Kiva shook her head. I just feel the cold. Lizzie smiled, a sharp, genuine thing. Pack your bags, Kiva. I need an assistant who isn't a brainwashed soldier. You're coming with us. Chapter 5. The Forge of Friendship. Bramwell's protest was nearly loud enough to trigger an avalanche. A dormant? You want to bring a useless, wolfless peasant on a royal mission? Majesty, this is madness. The blacksmith is one thing, but this is a liability. Torsten looked at Kiva, who was shrinking back toward the well, and then at Lizzie, who was standing like a stone wall between the girl and the beta. She stays, Torsten said, his voice cracking like a whip. If Lizzie says she is useful, she is useful. I am tired of debating the value of those you deem broken, Bramwell. The whole wolves are the ones losing their minds in the north. Perhaps it is time we relied on those who aren't so easily swayed by the wind. Lizzie gave Kiva a wink. Go on, get your things, and bring a good knife if you have one. If not, I'll make you one tonight. By the time they set up camp that evening, the dynamic had shifted. Kiva proved her worth immediately by identifying the local herbs that could mask their campfire smoke, knowledge the warrior wolves usually ignored in favor of their own scent-cloaking abilities. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Lizzie set up her portable anvil near the fire. The rhythmic clink, clink, clink of her hammer against a glowing strip of silver was the only sound in the quiet woods. Torsten sat on a fallen log, watching her. He was mesmerized by the way she moved, efficient, powerful, and utterly focused. She didn't seek his approval. She didn't even look at him. Why silver, Lizzie? Torsten asked, his voice low. Most rogues prefer steel or iron. Silver is a noble metal, but it's soft. Steel is for killing, Lizzie said without breaking her rhythm. Silver is for binding. It's the only thing that holds its shape when the world goes crazy, and it's the only thing that hurts the feral without poisoning the land. I'm not just a smith, Torsten. I'm a silversmith. I make things that last. She quenched the metal in a bucket of water, a hiss of steam rising into the air. She held up a small, elegant dagger and handed it to Kiva. There, moonglass edge. It'll cut through a feral's hide like butter. Kiva took the blade, her fingers trembling with awe. Thank you, Lizzie. No one has ever... I've never had anything of my own. Now you do, Lizzie said. She finally looked at Torsten. And don't think I didn't see you staring. If you want a lesson in metallurgy, it'll cost you. My indentured status doesn't include free lectures. Torsten chuckled, leaning back against a tree. And what would the price be, Outrider? A story, Lizzie said, her gaze turning sharp. Tell me why a king who can flatten a mountain with a growl is so afraid of a little plague. You're not just hunting the feral, you're looking for someone, aren't you? The humor vanished from Torsten's face. The campfire light danced in his golden eyes, revealing a depth of pain that made even Lizzie pause. My brother, Torsten whispered. He was the first to turn, and he is the one leading the pack that is coming for us. Lizzie didn't offer pity. She just picked up her hammer again. Then we'd better make sure your boots are polished, Torsten. If you're going to face your brother, you'd better look like a king when you do it. For the first time, Torsten felt a strange warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with his wolf. It was the feeling of someone standing beside him, not because they had to, but because they chose to. Chapter 6. The Watcher in the Mist. The tree line of the north was not made of wood and leaf, but of jagged, ice-coated spears. As the small company rode deeper into the Vale Woods, the sun became a pale, useless coin behind a curtain of gray fog. The silence here was different. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of nature, but the bated breath of a predator waiting to strike. Lizzie rode Ironhoof at the front, her back straight and her hand resting casually on her hammer. Behind her, Torsten sat atop his massive stallion, his golden eyes scanning the mist. He looked like a statue of ancient iron, but Lizzie could hear the faint, rhythmic clicking of his armor as his muscles tensed. You're vibrating again, Lizzie said, her voice cutting through the fog like a sharp blade. If you're trying to scare the trees with that alpha hum of yours, save your breath. The trees aren't impressed, and neither am I." Torsten didn't look at her, but his voice was a low, dangerous rumble. "The air is wrong, Lizzie. It carries the scent of bile and old blood. We are close to a feral crossing. My guards are already struggling to breathe through their filters." Behind them, Bramwell and the Void Guard were indeed hunched over their saddles, their heavy leather masks straining to filter the pheromonal toxins of the plague. Kiva, riding a sturdy pony Lizzie had requisitioned for her, looked pale but stable. Like Lizzie, her lack of a wolf gave her a degree of immunity to the sensory overload. "I told you," Lizzie said, patting Ironhoof's neck. "While your warriors are busy suffocating on bad smells, I'm the only one looking at the ground. There's a fresh drag mark in the slush over there. Something heavy, and it's not a deer." Torsten pulled his horse to a stop. "Where?" Lizzie pointed to a patch of disturbed snow near a cluster of frozen pines. "About 20 yards out. It leads toward that ravine. Whatever made it has long claws and doesn't lift its feet. If I had to guess, I'd say it's one of your subjects who's forgotten how to walk on 2 legs." Bramwell let out a muffled growl through his mask. "She is guessing. We should stick to the main path. Majesty, do not listen to this blacksmith." "The blacksmith is the only one who isn't currently choking on his own spit, Bramwell," Torsten snapped. He looked at Lizzie, his gaze intense. "If we follow that trail, we might find their nesting ground. But if we do, I cannot guarantee the safety of your assistant." Lizzie glanced back at Kiva. The dormant girl clutched the silver dagger Lizzie had forged for her, her knuckles white. Kiva nodded once, her jaw set. "Kiva is with me," Lizzie said, turning back to Torsten. "And I'm with you, which means you're stuck with us. Now, are we going to stand here and discuss my credentials, or are we going to hunt?" Torsten's smirk was slow and predatory. "We hunt." As they veered off the path, Lizzie felt a strange prickle at the back of her neck. She couldn't smell the danger, but she could feel the change in the air's temperature, the way the wind suddenly died down. She reached into her satchel and gripped a handful of silver dust. If something jumped out of that mist, she was going to make sure it regretted having eyes. Chapter 7. The Ravine of White Eyes. The drag mark led them to the lip of a jagged limestone ravine. Below, the mist was so thick it looked like a pool of milk. Torsten dismounted, his movements fluid and silent. He signaled for the Void Guard to stay back and establish a perimeter. "The scent is overwhelming here," Torsten whispered, his hand going to the hilt of his black steel broadsword. "It is a physical wall. Bramwell, do not descend. Your mind will snap within minutes." "But, Majesty—" "That is an order," Torsten commanded. He looked at Lizzie. "Can you see anything?" Lizzie knelt at the edge of the ravine, her smith-trained eyes picking through the gloom. She saw movement, flickers of gray and white. "They're down there, maybe a dozen. They're huddling together for warmth, I think. Or maybe they're just waiting." "They don't huddle for warmth," Torsten said, his voice grim. "They huddle to share the madness. It strengthens the hive mind." Lizzie stood up, her jaw set in a hard line. "Well, they're blocking the only pass to the northern keep. We can't go around unless we want to add 3 days to the trip." She pulled her heavy forging hammer from her belt. It wasn't a dainty weapon. It was a 3-pound hunk of tempered steel with a silver-plated head. Kiva stepped up beside her. "I have the herbal pouches ready, Lizzie. If we throw them into the center, the smoke might dampen the scent enough for the king to move without losing his focus." Torsten looked at the 2 women, the scent-blind smith and the wolfless dormant. They were the 2 weakest members of his company by pack standards, yet here they were, planning a tactical strike while his elite guards trembled on the ridge. "You truly have no fear of me, do you?" Torsten asked, his voice barely audible over the wind. Lizzie looked him up and down. "You're just a man, Torsten. A big, brooding, slightly arrogant man who's currently in my way. Now move aside. Kiva, on my mark." Kiva tossed the pouches. They hit the bottom of the ravine and burst into clouds of pungent, bitter smoke. Below, the feral wolves began to howl, a sound that was more of a wet, guttural scream. Lizzie didn't wait. She slid down the embankment, her boots carving a path through the scree. As she hit the bottom, the first feral lunged. It was a massive creature, its fur falling out in patches, its eyes a weeping, milky white. It didn't smell like a wolf to Lizzie. It looked like a nightmare. She swung her hammer. The silver-plated head caught the creature in the jaw with a sickening crack. The silver reacted instantly to the plague-crazed blood, cauterizing the wound with a burst of white sparks. The wolf fell, whimpering. "One down!" Lizzie shouted, pivoting as another lunged from the mist. Suddenly, a shadow loomed over her. Torsten had dived into the ravine, his broadsword a blur of black lightning. Even through the smoke, his alpha power was a terrifying force. He wasn't just fighting, he was a storm of fur and steel. But as the feral pheromones began to claw at his mind, he stumbled. Lizzie saw his eyes start to glaze. She stepped in front of him, her hammer held high. "Eyes on me, you big idiot! Focus on the sound of my voice. I'm the one you owe for the horse grooming, remember?" The sound of her blunt, unimpressed voice acted like an anchor. Torsten's eyes snapped back to gold. He let out a roar that shook the very walls of the ravine and rejoined the fray. Chapter 8. The Weight of the Crown. The skirmish was short and brutal. Within minutes, the ravine was silent, save for the heavy breathing of Torsten and the soft clinking of Lizzie's tools as she wiped the silver dust from her hammer. The feral had fled back into the deeper shadows of the woods, leaving 3 of their number dead in the snow. Torsten stood in the center of the clearing, his chest heaving. His skin was flushed, and sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cold. The toxins had taken a toll. He looked at the bodies of his fallen kin, his expression one of profound grief. "They were men once," he murmured, his voice thick. "They had packmates. Family." Lizzie walked over and stood beside him. She didn't offer a platitude. She didn't tell him it was okay. She just reached out and gripped his forearm, her calloused hand firm and grounding. "And now they're at peace. Better a silver strike than a life of madness, Torsten. You did what a king has to do." Torsten looked down at her. He was still radiating a heat so intense it felt like standing near a furnace. "You saved me back there. My mind was beginning to fracture. The scent, it was like drowning in oil." "I told you," Lizzie said, pulling her hand away and crossing her arms. "I'm the only one who can talk sense into you when you're being dramatic. Now, let's get out of this hole. Bramwell is probably up there writing your eulogy." As they climbed back up the ridge, Kiva met them at the top, handing them water skins. Bramwell approached cautiously, his eyes darting between the king and the bloody silver on Lizzie's hammer. "Majesty, you are unharmed?" Bramwell asked, his voice shaking. "Thanks to Lizzie," Torsten said, his voice regaining its royal steel. He turned to the Void Guard. "Set up camp 2 miles north of here. We move at first light. And Bramwell?" "Yes, Majesty. The next time you call my outrider broken, I will have you stripped of your rank and sent to the stables. She has more courage in her little finger than you have in your entire lineage." Bramwell bowed so low his forehead touched the snow. Lizzie just rolled her eyes and started leading Ironhoof toward the new campsite. That night, the camp was quiet, but the air was charged with a new tension. Kiva and Lizzie sat by their own small fire, away from the guards. Kiva was busy cleaning the silver-edged dagger, her eyes bright with a new kind of pride. "You really did it, Lizzie," Kiva whispered. "You talked to him like he was just a man." "Because he is just a man," Lizzie said, sharpening her own knife. "A man with a very heavy hat and a lot of baggage, but he's the only one who can stop this plague, so I suppose I'll have to keep him alive for at least another 3 weeks." She looked over at the king's tent. Torsten was standing at the entrance, his gaze fixed on her. Even in the dark, his eyes shone like gold. Lizzie didn't look away. She raised her knife in a mock salute, and for the first time, she saw the Shadow King actually smile. A small, private thing that made her heart do a strange, annoying little hop in her chest. Chapter 9. The Crimson Moon. By the 10th day, the company had reached the foothills of the Iron Spine Mountains. The moon was approaching its zenith, turning a sickly, burnt crimson. A blood moon, the time when the wolf's instinct was at its most primal. For most packs, this was a time of celebration. For the feral, it was a time of hunger. Torsten was visibly struggling. The pull of the moon was exacerbated by the plague toxins lingering in his system. He spent most of the day in silence, his jaw clenched so tight Lizzie thought his teeth might shatter. "You're making that face again," Lizzie said as they rode through a narrow pass. "The one where you look like you're trying to swallow a rock." "The moon. It is loud tonight, Lizzie," Torsten gritted out. "Even for me, I can feel the madness scratching at the edges of my mind. It wants me to shift. It wants me to run until my paws bleed." "Then don't," Lizzie said simply. "You're the king. Tell the moon to mind its own business. Or better yet, talk to me. Tell me about that brother of yours. Why was he the first to turn?" Torsten sighed, a long, weary sound. "His name was Walter. He was everything I am not. Charismatic, loved. He was the one who was supposed to be king. But he was too curious. He traveled to the forbidden archives of the old blood, looking for a way to strengthen the packs. He found something else instead. A parasite of the mind." "A parasite?" Lizzie narrowed her eyes. "You mean this plague isn't natural?" "Nothing this cruel is natural," Torsten said. "Walter thought he could control it. He thought he could use it to make us immortal. But it consumed him. He became the first Hive Alpha. Now, he roams the north, gathering acolytes. He believes he is saving us by stripping away our humanity." Lizzie felt a chill that had nothing to do with the wind. "And you have to be the one to kill him." "It is my burden," Torsten said. He looked at her, his eyes bleeding into a deep, molten amber. "And tonight, on the blood moon, his pull is stronger than ever. He is calling to me, Lizzie. He wants me to join the family." Lizzie reached out and grabbed his reins, forcing his stallion to stop. She leaned over, her face inches from his. "Listen to me, Torsten. You are not joining anyone. You have a contract with me, 1 month. You owe me 3 more weeks of service, and I don't care if your brother is the Queen of the Moon. You're not leaving until the debt is paid. Do you understand?" Torsten stared at her, the sheer audacity of her words acting like a cold drench of water on his mounting fever. He let out a ragged breath, his shoulders dropping. "You are an impossible woman, Elizabeth." "I'm a businesswoman," she corrected him. "Now, let's find a cave. If you're going to be wolfy tonight, I'd rather you did it behind stone walls where I can keep an eye on you." They found a small cavern tucked into the mountainside. Torsten ordered the guards to stay at the mouth and keep a fire burning. He, however, retreated into the deepest part of the cave with Lizzie and Kiva. He needed the darkness. He needed the silence. And most of all, he needed the one person who wouldn't be afraid if he lost his grip on the man. Chapter 10. The Primal Vigil. The interior of the cave was damp and smelled of ancient stone. Lizzie set up her portable forge near the entrance of their inner chamber, the glow of the embers providing the only light. Kiva was curled up in a corner, fast asleep, her silver dagger clutched to her chest. Torsten was at the far wall, his back to Lizzie. He had stripped off his tunic, his massive muscles rippling as he fought the involuntary shifts of his form. His skin was slick with sweat, and a low, guttural purr, the sound of a predator in pain, echoed off the stone. "Lizzie," he wheezed, stay back. The moon is at its peak. My wolf. It is not kind tonight." "I've handled bigger dogs than you, Torsten," Lizzie said, her voice calm and steady. She was busy polishing a set of silver chains she had been working on. "Besides, you're the one who told me I was indentured to you. That means I have to look after the inventory. And right now, the inventory looks like it's having a meltdown." She walked over to him, ignoring his warning growl. She sat down on the stone floor right beside him. The heat coming off him was incredible, like sitting next to a roaring hearth. "You're burning up," she noted. She dipped a cloth into her water skin and pressed it against the back of his neck. Torsten flinched, his hand flying out to catch her wrist. His grip was bone-crushing, his claws beginning to lengthen. His eyes were no longer human. They were the eyes of a beast, wild and starving. Lizzie didn't pull away. She didn't scream. She just looked him dead in the eye. "Is that the best you've got? You're going to bruise my wrist because the moon is shining? Honestly, Torsten, I expected more from an apex." Torsten stared at her, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He saw the bruise forming under his fingers, and the horror of what he was doing began to override the madness. He let go of her as if she were made of red-hot iron. I am sorry," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I am becoming a monster, Lizzie." "You're becoming a wolf," she corrected him, rubbing her wrist. "There's a difference. A monster chooses to hurt people. A wolf just reacts. Now, put your head in my lap and shut up. I'm going to keep the cloth cool, and you're going to focus on the sound of my hammer." "Lizzie, that wasn't a request, stable boy." Torsten hesitated, then slowly lowered his head. He rested it on her lap, his massive frame trembling. Lizzie began to rhythmically tap her hammer against a small piece of silver on her anvil, the steady clink, clink, clink filling the cave. It was a strange sight, the most powerful king in the world, curled up like a pup in the lap of a scent-blind blacksmith. But as the hours passed and the blood moon reached its zenith, the madness didn't take him. The scent of the plague was outside, calling to him, but the sound of the hammer and the cool touch of Lizzie's hand kept him tethered to the world of men. When the first light of dawn finally crept into the cave, Torsten was asleep, his head still resting on Lizzie's legs. She was still tapping her hammer, her eyes red-rimmed with exhaustion, but her expression was one of quiet, fierce victory. She had held back the Shadow King, and she had done it without a single drop of magic, only silver, grit, and the refusal to be afraid. Chapter 11. The Frozen Gate. The morning after the blood moon was etched in frost and silence. Torsten was unusually quiet as they broke camp, his movements stiff. He didn't look at Lizzie directly, but he remained within arm's reach of her at all times. The power dynamic had shifted. He was no longer just the king commanding an indentured servant. He was a man who had shared his darkest hour with the only person who didn't blink at his monstrosity. "The air is getting thinner," Lizzie observed, tugging at the collar of her fur-lined cloak. "And the ground is getting steeper. If we keep this pace, Ironhoof is going to need new shoes by nightfall." "We cannot slow down," Torsten replied, his voice still carrying the gravelly rasp of his night in the cave. "The northern keep is just beyond the next ridge. If Walter is there, he will already know we've arrived. The hive doesn't just smell, it feels." As they crested the final rise, the northern keep came into view. It was a terrifying structure of black basalt, built directly into the side of a glacier. Once a proud fortress of the Highland protectors, it now looked like a rotting tooth. Thick, sickly yellow vapors curled around the battlements, and the iron gates hung crookedly on their hinges. Bramwell and the Void Guard slowed their horses, their hands trembling as they adjusted their leather breathing masks. Even from this distance, the pheromonal pressure was immense. "It's a graveyard," Kiva whispered, her eyes wide as she clutched her silver dagger. "I can't feel the wolf madness, but the cold. It feels like it's trying to eat my bones." "Stay close to me, Kiva," Lizzie commanded, pulling her forging hammer from her belt. She looked at Torsten. "The gates are open. That's either an invitation or a trap. Probably both." Torsten drew his broadsword, the black steel humming with suppressed power. "The guards will stay here to secure the perimeter. They won't survive 5 minutes inside that fog. It has to be us." "And me," Kiva added, her voice shaky but determined. "You'll need my herbs if the toxins get too thick inside the stone walls." Bramwell stepped forward, his eyes bloodshot behind his visor. "Majesty, you cannot enter with only these two. It is suicide. Let us—" "You can barely stay on your horse, Bramwell," Torsten said, not unkindly. "Lizzie is my eyes. Kiva is our medicine. You are our retreat. If we do not return by sunset, you take the remaining silver to the southern provinces and tell them to burn the mountain passes." Lizzie didn't wait for a sentimental goodbye. She kicked Ironhoof into a walk, heading straight for the yawning black maw of the fortress. "Stop making speeches, Torsten. We're burning daylight, and I've got a month of service to finish. I'm not spending it standing in a snowdrift." As they crossed the threshold, the temperature dropped 20 degrees. The scent of the plague, a thick, oily musk, hit Torsten like a physical blow. He staggered, his golden eyes flickering, but Lizzie's voice rang out, sharp and grounding. "Left foot, right foot, stable boy. Keep walking or I'll use the hammer to remind you. Torsten took a breath, focused on the sway of Lizzie's shoulders, and stepped into the dark. Chapter 12. The Hall of Echoes. Inside the northern keep, the silence was suffocating. The walls were coated in a strange, bioluminescent fungus that pulsed with a faint, sickly green light. It gave the corridors an underwater feeling, distorted and treacherous. Lizzie led the way, her boots clicking sharply on the flagstones. She didn't have the heightened hearing of a wolf, but her Smith-trained ears picked up the subtle nuances of the environment. The drip of water, the groan of shifting ice, and the faint, rhythmic scratching of claws on stone. "They're in the walls," Lizzie whispered, her grip tightening on her hammer. "Don't look for them with your nose, Torsten. Use your eyes. They're moving in the rafters." Torsten growled, his hand tightening on his sword hilt. "I see them. Shadows within shadows. They aren't attacking. They're hurting us." "Toward the Great Hall," Kiva noted, pointing to the massive iron-bound doors at the end of the corridor. "The scent is strongest there. It feels like a hive of hornets in my chest." They reached the doors, which were covered in a thick, resinous substance. Lizzie stepped forward and inspected the lock. It wasn't a standard mechanism. It was a biological seal, pulsing with a slow, heartbeat-like rhythm. "This is disgusting," Lizzie muttered. She pulled a vial of silver dust from her pouch and blew it onto the resin. The silver sizzled, the heartbeat of the door spiking in a frantic wet thudding before the resin shriveled and blackened. With a heavy shove, the doors groaned open. The Great Hall was a nightmare of architecture. The high-vaulted ceiling was draped in webs of the same yellow fungus, and dozens of feral wolves hung from the pillars like bats, their milky eyes fixed on the intruders. In the center of the room sat a throne made of ice and bone, and on that throne sat Walter. He looked strikingly like Torsten, but his skin was unnervingly pale, and thin black veins climbed up his neck to his temples. He wasn't snarling, he was smiling. "Brother," Walter said, his voice echoing with a strange, multi-layered quality, as if dozens of people were speaking at once. "You finally arrived, and you brought companions, a scentless smith and a hollow girl. How very clever of you to find shields against my song." Torsten stepped forward, his alpha power clashing against the hive-mind aura of the room. The air between the two brothers rippled with invisible force. "It's over, Walter. The plague ends here. I will burn this place to the ground before I let you spread this filth any further." Walter laughed, a dry, rattling sound. "Filth? I have given them peace, Torsten. No more pack wars, no more hunger. We are one voice, one mind. I have reached the evolution our father only dreamed of." "You've reached a gutter!" Lizzie shouted, stepping up beside Torsten. "I don't know much about evolution, but I know what a parasite looks like. You're not a king. You're a tick on the back of your own people." Walter's eyes shifted to Lizzie, his smile fading into a look of cold curiosity. "The blacksmith. The one who treats the apex like a servant. I have heard your voice through the link, brother. She is quite the distraction, isn't she?" Chapter 13. The Song of the Hive. Walter stood up from his bone throne, his movements unnaturally fluid. As he moved, the feral wolves in the rafters began to drop to the floor, circling the trio with predatory grace. They didn't growl, they hummed, a low, discordant frequency that made Kiva clutch her ears in pain. "Listen to it, Torsten," Walter crooned, spreading his arms. "The song of the hive. It is the sound of absolute order. Why fight it? You are so tired of the wait. Let me take the crown from you. Join us, and you will never be alone again." Torsten's knees buckled. The song wasn't just sound, it was a psychic assault through the olfactory senses, bypassing his conscious mind. He dropped his sword, his hands flying to his head. "Get out of my mind!" "He can't hear you, Walter," Lizzie yelled, swinging her hammer in a wide arc to keep the circling wolves at bay. "He's too busy listening to me." She turned and grabbed Torsten by the front of his furs, shaking him violently. "Torsten, look at me! I am the only one in this room who isn't singing your stupid song. Focus on the silver. Focus on the debt." She reached into his pouch and pulled out the silver mark, the coin she had given him on that first night. She pressed it hard into his palm, the cold metal biting into his skin. The physical sensation, combined with the grounding sound of her voice, acted like a lightning rod. Torsten's eyes snapped back to their brilliant gold. He let out a roar that shattered the bioluminescent fungus on the walls, his own alpha aura exploding outward with such force that several feral wolves were thrown back against the pillars. "I am the king of the 7 territories," Torsten bellowed, his voice reclaiming its divine authority. "And I do not take orders from a corpse." Walter's expression turned venomous. "So be it. If you will not lead the hive, you will feed it." With a flick of his wrist, the feral wolves lunged. "Kiva, the smoke!" Lizzie screamed. Kiva reached into her satchel and threw 3 glass spheres into the center of the room. They shattered, releasing a thick purple haze of concentrated herbs, wolfsbane, sage, and mountain root. The scent was so bitter and intense, it disrupted the pheromonal song, sending the feral wolves into a confused, yelping frenzy. "Now!" Lizzie shouted. She and Torsten moved as one. While Torsten's sword carved through the front line of the feral, Lizzie focused on the architecture. She saw the pillars were cracked, held together by the fungus. If she could take out the supports, she could bring the whole hall down on Walter's head. "Torsten, keep them off me!" she yelled, sprinting toward the nearest pillar. "I'm going to renovate this place." Chapter 14. Renovating the Abyss. Lizzie reached the first pillar, her muscles screaming as she swung her heavy hammer. Crack! The silver-plated head smashed into the basalt, the silver reacting to the fungal glue and causing it to shrivel in a burst of white sparks. The pillar groaned, a hairline fracture spiderwebbing toward the ceiling. "2 more!" she shouted over the chaos of the battle. Torsten was a whirlwind of black steel. He was protecting her, moving with a speed that defied his massive size. He was no longer fighting the madness. He was using his rage to fuel his focus. Every time a feral got too close to Lizzie, Torsten was there, his broadsword ending the threat before it could strike. Walter, however, was not idle. He watched the destruction of his hall with a terrifying calmness. He began to shift, but it wasn't a clean transformation. His body distorted, limbs lengthening, fur sprouting in oily black clumps. He was becoming something larger and more grotesque than a standard wolf, the hive alpha form. "You think silver can save you?" Walter's voice was now a distorted boom. "I am the mountain itself!" He lunged for Lizzie, his massive claws raking the air. Torsten intercepted him, the 2 brothers colliding with a force that shook the entire keep. They tumbled across the floor, a blur of fur and steel. "Lizzie, hurry!" Kiva cried out, using her silver dagger to ward off a smaller feral that had crawled out from under the throne. Lizzie reached the second pillar. She didn't just swing, she used her smith's knowledge of structural integrity. She found the keystone, the one holding the most weight. She struck it with every ounce of strength she possessed. The sound was like a thunderclap. The ceiling began to shed massive chunks of ice and stone. "One left!" Lizzie screamed, her lungs burning from the herbal smoke and the dust. She turned to see Torsten pinned beneath Walter's massive, mutated form. Walter's black veins were pulsing, and he was leaning in, trying to sink his teeth into Torsten's throat to deliver the final, lethal dose of the plague. "Torsten!" Lizzie didn't think. She grabbed a handful of silver dust and sprinted toward the 2 alphas. She leaped onto Walter's back, her small hands gripping his oily fur, and slammed the silver dust directly into his weeping, milky eyes. Walter let out a scream that sounded like 1,000 dying wolves. He reared back, pawing at his face as the silver cauterized his corrupted flesh. Torsten scrambled out from under him, gasping for air. He looked at Lizzie, who was currently sliding off the back of a mutated monster. "Get the last pillar, now!" Lizzie didn't need to be told twice. She sprinted for the final support. She didn't just hit it. She poured all her frustration, all her feist, and all her strange, burgeoning love for the brooding king into the blow. Crack! The northern keep let out a final, dying shriek. The glacier above began to groan. Chapter 15. The Intoxicating Escape. Out! Everyone out! Torsten roared, grabbing Lizzie by the waist and tucking her under his arm like a sack of grain. Hey, put me down, I can walk! Lizzie protested, though she didn't fight him as the ceiling began to rain boulders the size of horses. Torsten ignored her, his eyes fixed on Kiva. Kiva, run! The three of them sprinted for the corridor as the great hall collapsed behind them. Walter's final scream was cut short by 1,000,000 tons of ice and black basalt. The song vanished instantly, replaced by the roar of the mountain reclaiming its own. They burst through the outer gates just as the entire front of the keep subsided into a massive avalanche. They tumbled into the snow, rolling until they were far enough away from the path of the slide. Silence returned to the Iron Spine Mountains. Torsten lay in the snow, his chest heaving, his human form returning. He was covered in soot, blood, and fungal slime, but his eyes were clear. He looked at the pile of rubble that was once the northern keep. The hive was gone. The pheromonal pressure had vanished, leaving the air crisp and cold. Kiva sat up, clutching her satchel, her face pale but her eyes shining with triumph. We did it! We actually did it! Lizzie sat up and brushed the snow off her leathers. She looked at Torsten, who was staring at her with an intensity that made the hair on her arms stand up. The adrenaline was still pumping through her veins, making her heart hammer against her ribs. You're a mess, she said, her voice unusually soft. Torsten didn't say anything. He reached out, his hand trembling slightly, and cupped her face. His thumb brushed over a small cut on her cheek. The heat coming off him wasn't the fever of the plague. It was something else entirely, something primal, focused, and intoxicating. You saved me, he whispered. Again. Why? You could have run. You could have left me to the hive. Lizzie leaned into his hand, her blunt facade finally cracking. I told you, stable boy, your month isn't up, and I'm not the kind of woman who leaves a job half-finished. The look in Torsten's eyes changed. It was no longer the look of a king or a warrior. It was the look of a man who had found the only thing in the world that mattered. Before she could say another word, he pulled her into him. The kiss was like the collapse of the keep, violent, overwhelming, and a long time coming. It tasted of silver, snow, and survival. For Lizzie, the scent-blind smith, the world finally had a scent. It smelled like Torsten, like iron, wood smoke, and home. In the distance, Bramwell and the guards were riding toward them, but for the first time in his life, the king didn't care who was watching. He held her as if she were the only solid thing in a crumbling world. Chapter 16. The Morning After the Avalanche. The valley was a graveyard of white. The avalanche had settled into a jagged, frozen sea that buried the secrets of the northern keep under millions of tons of ice. Lizzie sat on a flat rock, methodically sharpening a small chisel. Her hands were steady, but her mind was a chaotic forge of heat and confusion. The memory of Torsten's lips against hers was a persistent spark she couldn't quench. You're sharpening that too far, a deep voice rumbled behind her. Lizzie didn't turn. She knew the vibration of his step now. And you're standing in my light. Move along, stable boy. I'm sure you have a kingdom to fret over, or a cape to iron. Torsten stepped into her view, but he didn't move away. He was still wearing the battered, soot-stained leathers from the fight, his golden eyes searching her face. The guards are ready to move. Bramwell has secured the remaining silver. We head south at midday. Good, Lizzie said, finally looking up. The sooner we get to a real forge, the sooner I can fix this hammer. It's got a hairline fracture near the haft. If I hit anything else with it, it'll shatter like glass. Torsten knelt beside her, his presence a physical warmth that made the biting mountain air feel distant. He reached out, his fingers brushing against her knuckles before she could pull away. About the kiss, Elizabeth. It was adrenaline, she snapped, though her heart hammered a rhythm that betrayed her. We were nearly crushed by a mountain. People do stupid things when they think they're about to die. It's a biological glitch. Don't let it go to that oversized head of yours. Torsten's smirk was slow and infuriatingly patient. Is that what you call it? A glitch? I remember it feeling quite intentional. Well, you remember wrong, Lizzie lied, standing up and shoving her tools into her satchel. You've still got 2 weeks on our contract, Torsten. Don't make it awkward. I have work to do, and I don't work well when my employer is looking at me like I'm a prize mare. I am not looking at you like a prize, Torsten said, his voice dropping to that low, intimate register that always made her knees feel like lead. I am looking at you like the woman who brought down a glacier to save my soul. If that makes you uncomfortable, perhaps it is because you aren't as immune to me as you claim. Lizzie opened her mouth to deliver a devastating retort, but Kiva approached, carrying a tray of hot pine needle tea. The dormant girl looked between the two of them, a knowing smile playing on her lips. The tea is ready, Kiva said, and Bramwell looks like he's about to faint from the suspense of waiting for the king's orders. Should I tell him we're staying for another argument, or are we moving? Lizzie grabbed a cup, glaring at Torsten. We're moving! Some of us actually have a business to get back to. Chapter 17. The Beta's Burden. The descent from the Iron Spine Mountains was swifter than the climb. With the Hive Alpha dead, the suffocating pheromonal pressure had lifted, allowing the Void Guard to breathe freely for the first time in weeks. However, a new tension had replaced the old one. Bramwell, the King's Beta, rode 10 paces behind Lizzie and Torsten, his eyes fixed on the back of Lizzie's head with a mixture of awe and simmering anxiety. He's staring at me again, Lizzie muttered to Torsten as they navigated a narrow switchback. If he keeps it up, I'm going to throw a horseshoe at him. He is confused, Lizzie, Torsten replied, his tone amused. In his world, alphas lead, betas follow, and everyone else stays out of the way. You have broken every law of his reality. You berate me, you save me, and you refuse to bow. He doesn't know whether to execute you or build you a shrine. A shrine would be better. I could use the extra storage space for my coal, Lizzie said. She looked back at Bramwell, who immediately averted his gaze. He's a traditionalist. He thinks the world is built on sense and ranks. He can't handle the fact that a broken smith is the reason he's still drawing breath. None of us can handle you, Elizabeth, Torsten said softly. They reached a small outpost at the base of the mountains by dusk. It was a sturdy stone building used by hunters and travelers. As they dismounted, Bramwell finally approached the king, his posture stiff. Majesty, a word? Bramwell asked. Torsten nodded and stepped aside. Lizzie, naturally, stayed right where she was, pretending to check Ironhoof's girth while listening with every bit of her smith-honed hearing. The council in the capital will not be pleased, Bramwell whispered. You are returning with a rogue smith and a dormant as your primary advisors. The High Packs, they expect a queen of noble scent. Lady Sybil has already arrived at the palace to prepare for your homecoming. Lizzie's hands stilled on the leather straps. Lady Sybil. She didn't know the name, but she knew the type. High-born, high-scent, and likely looking for a high-status mating bond. The council can expect whatever they wish. Torsten's voice was like grinding stone. I have just buried my brother and the hive. If any alpha in the capital wishes to challenge my choice of company, they are welcome to meet me in the pit. As for Sybil, she is a political convenience I no longer find convenient. But the lineage, Majesty! The bloodline must be pure! Elizabeth's lineage is older than yours, Bramwell, Torsten said, his voice rising in warning. Her family held the southern forges when yours were still living in caves. Her father's disgrace was a matter of politics, not blood. Never forget that. Lizzie felt a lump in her throat. Torsten knew. He had looked into her history, into the fall of the Halloway house. He hadn't just seen a rogue, he had seen the daughter of a fallen baron. She tightened the strap with a sharp jerk, her eyes stinging. Chapter 18. The Smith's Secret. Inside the outpost, a fire roared in the communal hearth. Kiva was busy preparing a stew, humming to herself as she worked. Lizzie sat in a dark corner, her damaged hammer across her lap. She felt the weight of Torsten's words from earlier. Elizabeth Halloway. A name she hadn't used in 10 years. Torsten walked over and sat on the bench opposite her. He didn't say anything at first, simply watching the way the firelight danced on her silver-stained fingers. How did you find out? She asked, her voice low. I am the king, Lizzie, he said gently. When a woman enters my outpost with the skill to refine moonglass silver, a secret held only by the Holloway Smiths. It doesn't take much to connect the dots. I knew who you were the moment you tossed that coin at me." "Then why play along?" she challenged, her chin lifting. "Why let me pretend I was just some gutter rogue?" "Because I liked the gutter rogue," Torsten admitted. "She was the first person in decades who didn't want anything from the king. She just wanted her horse groomed. I didn't want to lose that. If I had addressed you as Lady Elizabeth, you would have vanished into the night before the first snow fell." Lizzie let out a ragged breath. "My father was framed, Torsten. He didn't sell the silver to the rebels. He was a man of honor. The High Alpha at the time needed a scapegoat for the border raids, and the Halloways were an easy target. They stripped our lands, burned the forges, and told us we were no longer fit to be part of the pack." "I know," Torsten said. He reached across the table, covering her hand with his. "And I know that for 10 years, you've been rebuilding that reputation in the shadows. Providing medicine, refining silver, surviving. You are more noble than any alpha in my court." Lizzie pulled her hand away, but not unkindly. "It doesn't matter. I'm still scent blind. In the eyes of your people, I'm a defect. I can't scent a lie, I can't scent a threat, and I can't scent you." Torsten stood up and moved to her side of the bench. He leaned in, his breath warm against her ear. "You don't need to scent me, Elizabeth. You feel me. In the cave, on the mountain, in the snow. You know me better than anyone who uses their nose. The capital will try to tell you that you are less, but I am the king, and I am telling you that you are everything." Lizzie felt the familiar, henpecked urge to argue, to snap at him for being sentimental. But for once, the words wouldn't come. She just leaned her head against his shoulder, the smell of iron and wood smoke wrapping around her like a shield. 2 weeks, Torsten," she whispered. "That's all the time we have before the world tries to pull us apart." "Then we shall make them the longest 2 weeks in history," he promised. Chapter 19. The Road to Oakhaven. The company crossed into the central provinces the following week. The landscape changed from jagged ice to rolling hills of ancient oak and fertile farmland. This was the heart of the kingdom, the high province of Oakhaven. Here, the wolf packs lived in sprawling estates, and the social hierarchy was as rigid as the stone walls of the capital. As they rode through the villages, the news of the king's return spread like wildfire. People lined the roads, but the cheers were muffled by confusion. At the head of the column rode their king, scarred and mud-stained, but beside him sat a common-looking woman in smithing leathers, and behind her, a girl who clearly carried no wolf scent. "They're staring," Kiva whispered, riding close to Lizzie. "They look like they've seen a ghost." "They've seen something worse," Lizzie replied, her eyes forward. "They've seen change. People hate change, Kiva. It makes them feel like their world is about to tip over. Just keep your chin up and keep that silver dagger visible. Let them know we aren't victims." Torsten was a different man in these lands. His alpha presence, which had been a survival tool in the north, was now a political weapon. He radiated a cold, unyielding power that silenced the crowds. Every time someone looked at Lizzie with disdain, Torsten's golden gaze would lock onto them until they looked away in fear. "You're being a bully," Lizzie noted as they approached the capital's outer gates. "I am being a king, Elizabeth," Torsten replied. "I am setting the tone for what is to come. If they learn now that you are under my protection, it will save us many headaches later." "I don't need your protection," she snapped, though a part of her felt a warm glow at his possessiveness. "I have a hammer and a bad attitude. That's usually enough for most people." "It won't be enough for Lady Sybil," Torsten warned. "She is the daughter of the Duke of the Western Marches. She believes her scent is the only one worthy of the throne. She will use every subtle insult and social trap in the book to try and drive you away." Lizzie smirked, a dangerous glint in her eyes. "Good. I haven't had a good verbal sparring match in years. If she thinks she can out-talk a woman who spent her life haggling with stubborn miners and drunken soldiers, she's in for a very rude awakening." Torsten chuckled. "That is exactly what I am counting on." As the massive iron gates of the capital city swung open, the bells of the great cathedral began to toll. The Shadow King had returned, and he was bringing a storm with him. Chapter 20. The Golden Hall. The Palace of Oakhaven was a masterpiece of gold leaf, white marble, and velvet. To Lizzie, it felt like a cage. The air was thick with the perfumes of 100 high-born wolves, essence of jasmine, cedar, and musk that meant nothing to her, but clearly weighed heavily on everyone else. As the company marched into the Golden Hall, the court fell silent. At the far end of the room, near the throne, stood a woman who could only be Lady Sybil. She was beautiful in a cold, sharp way, dressed in silks the color of a summer sky. Her essence, judging by the way the male wolves around her were leaning in, was intoxicating. Torsten didn't stop until he reached the foot of the throne. He didn't bow. He simply stood there, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. "Majesty," Sybil said, her voice like honey and glass. She stepped forward, her eyes darting to Lizzie with a flicker of pure disgust before returning to Torsten. "We were beginning to fear the North had claimed you, and what is this you have brought back? A retinue of servants? Surely they should be sent to the kitchens to be cleaned." Lizzie stepped forward before Torsten could speak. She didn't bow either. She wiped a smudge of horse grime from her cheek and looked Sybil dead in the eye. "The kitchens?" Lizzie said, her voice ringing clearly through the hall. "I wouldn't know my way around a stove, but I do know how to refine silver. And considering the servants you're looking at are the ones who just buried your king's brother and stopped a plague from reaching your precious silk dresses, I suggest you watch your tone." The hall erupted in whispers. No one spoke to a duke's daughter that way. Sybil's eyes narrowed, her nostrils flaring as she tried to use her alpha pheromones to cow the interloper. "You have no scent, girl. You are a void, a defect. You shouldn't even be standing in the presence of the apex." "I'm standing here because the apex asked me to," Lizzie retorted, stepping into Sybil's personal space. "And as for my scent, I'm glad I can't smell yours. It probably smells like desperation and too much rosewater. Now, Torsten, if we're done with the introductions, I'd like to find the Royal Forge. I have a hammer to fix, and this room is giving me a headache." Torsten looked at Sybil, then at Lizzie, a look of pure, unadulterated pride on his face. "Bramwell, show the Lady Elizabeth to the West Wing. She is to have the finest quarters and full access to the royal armory." He then looked at the stunned court. "And let it be known, Elizabeth Halloway is my outrider. Her word is my word. If anyone has an issue with that, the pit is open for challenges at dawn." Lizzie walked away without a backward glance, but as she passed Torsten, she whispered, "You're still a bully." "And you're still the one in charge," he whispered back. Chapter 21. The Royal Forge. The Royal Forge of Oakhaven was a cathedral of industry. High vaulted ceilings trapped the heat of a dozen massive furnaces, and the air hummed with the steady, rhythmic heartbeat of heavy water hammers. To Lizzie, it was the first place in the capital that didn't feel like a perfume trap. It felt like home. "You're standing in the draft again, Torsten," Lizzie shouted over the roar of the fires. She was stripped down to her soot-stained leather apron and a light linen tunic, her hair tied back in a messy knot. She didn't look like a lady of the court, and she didn't care. Torsten was leaning against a stone pillar, watching her with an intensity that rivaled the furnace's glow. He had discarded his royal furs, his sheer physical presence making the master smith of the palace look like a trembling apprentice. "I am making sure no one disturbs the king's outrider while she works." "I don't need a bodyguard. I need a heavier tongs," Lizzie snapped, though her eyes were focused on the white-hot head of her hammer. She was performing a delicate soul weld on the hairline fracture. One wrong strike, and the tempered silver would shatter. As the silver fused, Lizzie didn't just repair the tool. She poured her intent into the weld. The hammer didn't just feel whole, it felt alive, humming with a frequency that mirrored her own steady heartbeat. She pulled the metal from the coals and began a series of rapid, precise taps. Clink, clink, clink. And besides, if Sybil wants to come down here and try to sabotage my work, let her. I'd love to see what 100 gold drachma silk dress looks like when it meets a bucket of quenching oil. Torsten chuckled, the sound vibrating in his chest. Sybil wouldn't dare set foot in a place this unrefined. She is currently busy whispering to the High Council about your lack of a wolf spirit. They are meeting tonight to discuss your suitability. Suitability? Lizzie paused, her hammer held mid-air. She looked at him, her face flushed from the heat. "I'm an employee, Torsten. I'm here to finish a month of service and maybe stop a plague. I'm not applying for a position as your pet. Tell your council to shove their suitability into their ass crack." "I told them something similar, though with more kingly vocabulary," Torsten said, stepping closer. The heat of the forge seemed to amplify his alpha scent. That wood smoke and iron Lizzie was finally beginning to recognize. "But you must understand, Elizabeth. To them, the lack of a scent means you are a ghost. They fear what they cannot read." "Good," Lizzie said, returning to her work with a fierce strike. "Let them be afraid. It'll keep them from trying to steal my tools." She finished the weld and plunged the hammer into the quenching vat. The hiss of steam filled the room, wrapping them in a private, white cloud. In the mist, Torsten reached out, his hand finding her waist. "The month is half over," he whispered. "What happens when the debt is paid, Lizzie? Do you go back to your rogue forge and leave me to these vipers?" Lizzie looked at the hammer in the water, then at the man holding her. "I don't leave jobs half finished, Torsten, and right now, this kingdom is a very messy piece of work. It's going to take more than a month to beat it into shape." Chapter 22. The Silk Trap. The invitation arrived that evening, delivered by a page who looked like he wanted to bolt for the door. It was a summons to the Gala of the Moon, the most prestigious social event of the Oakhaven calendar. More importantly, the dress code was strictly ancient noble. "They're trying to smoke you out, Lizzie," Kiva said, holding the gold-inked parchment as they sat in their West Wing quarters. "They want to see if a Halloway can still look like a baron's daughter, or if you're just a blacksmith in a stolen title." "It's a trap," Lizzie agreed, leaning back in her velvet chair with her boots up on the table. "Sybil wants me in a corset and a gown so she can point out how uncomfortable I look. She thinks that if I can't dance their stupid dances or smell their subtle insults, I'll run back to the mountains." "Will you?" Kiva asked softly. Lizzie looked at her scarred hands. "No, but I'm not playing by her rules. If I'm going to a ball, I'm going as a Halloway, and a Halloway doesn't wear silk. We wear silver." For the next 3 days, Lizzie locked herself in the royal forge. She wasn't fixing tools anymore, she was crafting. Torsten tried to visit, but she had the master smith bar the door, claiming she was working on secret armaments. On the night of the gala, the Golden Hall was a sea of shimmering fabrics and oppressive perfumes. Sybil was at the center of a circle of alpha lords, wearing a dress of translucent gossamer that left very little to the imagination. She was radiating a mating-ready essence that had half the room in a daze. "Where is our king's little pet?" Sybil asked loudly, her voice carrying across the room. "I heard she was seen stealing coal from the furnaces yesterday. Perhaps she's decided to stay in the cellar where she belongs." The doors to the hall swung open. The herald didn't even have a chance to announce her before the room went dead silent. Elizabeth Halloway didn't wear a gown. She wore a suit of tailored, midnight blue velvet, but over it, she had fashioned a breastplate and pauldrons made of hammered, polished moonglass silver. It was as light as lace and shone with an ethereal, white brilliance that made the gold leaf in the room look dull. She wore her hair in a fierce braid, and at her side, she carried the silver-plated hammer she had repaired. She looked like a war goddess. Behind her, Kiva followed, dressed in elegant green, carrying a fan that was secretly a sheath for her herbal toxins. Lizzie walked straight to the center of the room. She didn't look for Torsten, she looked for Sybil. She stopped 3 feet from the Duke's daughter, the silver of her armor reflecting the candlelight so intensely it made Sybil squint. "You mentioned the cellar?" Lizzie said, her voice clear and cool. "I was busy. I figured if I was going to spend an evening in a room full of people who talk behind backs, I'd better wear something that can't be tarnished. Now, where's the drink? This armor is heavy and I'm parched." Chapter 23. The Alpha's Choice. Torsten appeared from the shadows behind the throne, dressed in his full regalia, but his eyes were only for Lizzie. He didn't offer her a hand, he offered her a challenge. "You look formidable, Outrider," he said, his voice carrying the alpha hum that usually made everyone bow. "I look like I'm about to fix a problem," Lizzie replied, grabbing a glass of wine from a passing servant. She looked at the High Council members who were hovering nearby like vultures. Is this where I'm supposed to curtsy and pretend I don't know they're all plotting to exile me? One of the councilmen, an old, gray-maned wolf named Lord Harkin, stepped forward. He sniffed the air aggressively. You have no scent, girl. You are a void. How can we trust a woman whose soul we cannot read? Lizzie didn't flinch. She stepped into Harkin's personal space, her silver breastplate clinking softly. You can't read me with your nose, Harkin? That sounds like a you problem. Maybe if you spent less time sniffing and more time looking, you'd see that I'm the only one in this room who isn't trying to suck up to the king for a land grant. Harkin recoiled, his face turning purple. Insolence! Majesty, how can you allow this? Torsten stepped beside Lizzie, his hand dropping to her armored shoulder. The weight of his presence was so immense that Harkin actually took a step back. She is not being insolent, Harkin. She is being honest, a concept you find unfamiliar. Torsten looked around the room, his golden eyes flashing. The High Council has spent the last hour debating Elizabeth's suitability. I am done with debates. Tonight is not a celebration of the moon, it is a celebration of the truth. The feral plague was defeated, not by sense or bloodlines, but by the grit of a woman you call broken. He turned to Lizzie, and for a moment, the room disappeared. Will you dance with me, Elizabeth? Or is that against your professional code? I don't dance, Torsten. It's inefficient, Lizzie said, though she felt that annoying, treacherous thrum hammering in her chest again. Then we shall simply move rhythmically, while I tell you how much I hate these people, he whispered. Lizzie smirked. Well, when you put it that way. She took his hand. As they moved to the center of the floor, the music began, a slow, ancient Highland melody. To the court, it was a scandal. To Sybil, it was a declaration of war. But to Lizzie, as she felt Torsten's hand on her back and the heat of his body against her silver armor, it was the first time she realized that the void in her world was being filled by the presence of wood smoke and iron. Chapter 24. Sabotage in the Shadows. The dance ended with a tension so thick it felt like a physical weight. As Torsten was pulled away by the High Council for a mandatory ritual, Lizzie retreated to the terrace to catch her breath. The silver of her armor was cool against her skin, but her heart was still racing. You think you've won, don't you? Sybil was standing by the stone balustrade, her face twisted in a mask of cold fury. She was no longer hiding her scent, she was projecting it, a cloying, suffocating aroma of rotted roses. You think because he dances with you, you are his equal? You are a tool, blacksmith, a hammer he will use until the plague is gone, and then he will discard you for a real woman. Lizzie leaned against the railing, looking out over the moonlit gardens. You're very repetitive, Sybil. Does it ever get exhausting being this bitter? You should try a hobby. I hear embroidery is good for the nerves. I am the future of this kingdom, Sybil hissed, stepping closer. My lineage is pure. My scent is the strongest in the West. And you are nothing. A broken toy from a disgraced house. Sybil reached into her silks and pulled out a small glass vial. Before Lizzie could react, Sybil smashed it on the stone at Lizzie's feet. A thick, oily vapor erupted, the exact essence of the feral plague, concentrated and weaponized. If you're so immune to scent, let's see how you handle this, Sybil sneered. Lizzie didn't feel the madness, but she felt the physical effect of the vapor. It was a chemical irritant designed to trigger an instinctive, violent shift in any wolf. Since Lizzie had no wolf to shift, her body simply reacted with a sudden, violent nausea. Her vision blurred, and her lungs felt like they were on fire. Oh, you foul bitch, Lizzie gasped, clutching her throat. Sybil laughed, a sharp, ugly sound. By the time the king finds you, you'll be retching in the dirt like the animal you are, and I will tell him you succumbed to the madness because you were too weak to resist it. Sybil turned to walk away, but Lizzie, even as she fell to one knee, reached out and grabbed Sybil's ankle. I told you, Lizzie wheezed, her hand tightening like a vice. I'm efficient. With a sharp tug, Lizzie pulled Sybil's feet out from under her. The Duke's daughter hit the marble with a satisfying thud, her gossamer dress tearing as she slid toward the edge of the terrace. Lizzie crawled toward her, her head swimming. She pulled a small pouch of silver dust from her belt, the secret armament she'd been working on. She blew it directly into the cloud of vapor. The silver reacted with the plague toxin, neutralizing the scent in a burst of white sparks. The air cleared instantly, though Lizzie was still gasping for air. "Next time," Lizzie croaked, looking down at a terrified Sybil, "use a bigger vial." Chapter 25. The Electrifying Surrender. Torsten found them a minute later. He had felt the spike of plague scent from across the hall and had moved like a thunderbolt. He saw the broken vial, the sparking silver dust, and Lizzie leaning against the railing, her face pale as death. He didn't even look at Sybil, who was scrambling to her feet, trying to fix her dress. He went straight to Lizzie, gathering her into his arms. "Elizabeth, are you hurt?" I'm fine," she coughed, though she leaned heavily into him. "Just a little lightheaded. Your girlfriend has terrible taste in perfume." "Sybil." Torsten's voice was a low, terrifying growl that made the stone of the terrace vibrate. "You used a feral extract in my palace, on my outrider." "It was a test, Majesty," Sybil cried, her voice trembling. "She is a fraud. I wanted to show you." "You will show yourself to the dungeons," Torsten interrupted, his gold eyes glowing with a lethal light. "Bramwell, take Lady Sybil away. She is to be held for treason against the crown." As the guards dragged the screaming Sybil away, Torsten carried Lizzie back to her quarters. He didn't put her in her bed. He sat with her by the fire in the west wing, holding her against his chest as her breathing finally steadied. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind a raw, intoxicating heat. Lizzie looked up at him, her armor still reflecting the firelight. The mask of the blunt, feisty Smith was gone, replaced by something much more vulnerable. "You shouldn't have done that," she whispered. "The High Council will hate you for arresting a duke's daughter." "Let them hate me," Torsten said. He traced the line of her jaw with his thumb. "I told you, Elizabeth, the month is almost over, and I have no intention of letting you go back to that rogue forge." "Torsten." "I don't want an outrider," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I don't want a Smith. I want you. Scent-blind, stubborn, talkative Elizabeth. I want the only woman who can look at a king and see a man who needs grooming." Lizzie looked at him, and for the first time she didn't fight the biological glitch. She reached up and pulled him down to her. The kiss wasn't like the one in the snow. It wasn't about survival. It was about surrender. It was intoxicating, a slow burn that tasted of iron, wood smoke, and a promise that no amount of palace politics could break. As Lizzie felt his hands on her waist and the vibration of his growl in her chest, she realized she wasn't a void. She was exactly where she was meant to be. "I'm still charging you for the silver dust," she whispered against his lips. "I'll pay whatever price you ask," he replied. Chapter 26. The Council's Ultimatum. The morning after the gala did not bring peace. It brought a cold, calculated fury. The Golden Hall, once filled with music, was now occupied by the High Council and a dozen Alpha Lords from the Western Marches. They stood in a phalanx of silk and steel, their collective presence creating a mountain of pressure that made the palace guards outside the door sweat through their tunics. Lizzie stood beside Torsten's throne, her silver armor polished and gleaming. She wasn't sitting, she was leaning against the stone dais, cleaning her fingernails with a small silver file. The lack of respect was a deliberate slap in the face to the lords below. "You cannot hold the daughter of a duke without a trial by her peers, Majesty," Lord Harkin boomed, his voice vibrating with alpha authority. "Sybil is of noble blood. To throw her in the dungeons like a common thief over the word of a scentless outrider is an insult to every great pack in this kingdom." Torsten didn't move. He looked like he had been carved from the basalt of the northern mountains. "The scentless outrider is the reason your lands aren't currently being grazed by mindless beasts, Harkin. Sybil used a weaponized plague extract inside these walls. That is not a social faux pas. It is an act of war against the crown." "We do not care for your justifications," another lord shouted. "Release her and exile the Halloway girl, or the Western Marches will withdraw their grain and their swords. You are king by our consent, Torsten. Do not forget that." Lizzie stopped filing her nails. She looked up, her gaze sharp enough to draw blood. Consent? That's a funny word for a group of people who were hiding in their cellars while Torsten was fighting in the snow. You want to talk about grain? My family's forges provided the plows for those fields long before you were wearing those fancy rings. She stepped down from the dais, her silver greaves clicking on the marble. You're not worried about Sybil. You're worried that if a broken smith can rise this high, then your precious little hierarchy is a lie. You're afraid that scent doesn't mean power. It just means you're loud. Harkin growled, a deep, visceral sound that usually made people collapse. Lizzie just blinked at him. Is that a growl, or do you have indigestion? Honestly, Harkin, if you're going to threaten a king, at least do it with some dignity. Torsten stood up, his hand dropping to the hilt of his broadsword. The alpha hum he released was so potent, it physically pushed the lords back a step. The ultimatum is rejected. Sybil stays in the darkness. Elizabeth stays by my side. If you wish to withdraw your grain, do it. But know that the first village to starve under your neglect will be the first village I reclaim with fire. The lords retreated, their faces twisted in masks of hatred. As the door slammed shut, Torsten let out a long, ragged breath. He looked at Lizzie, his golden eyes filled with a weary pride. You're making a lot of enemies for me, Lizzie, he murmured. I'm just identifying the ones you already had, she replied, reaching out to squeeze his hand. Now, let's go check on Kiva. She's been quiet all morning, and that usually means she's cooking up something dangerous. Chapter 27. The Shadow in the Dungeons. The palace dungeons were a labyrinth of damp stone and iron bars located deep beneath the west wing. Lizzie insisted on visiting Sybil. She didn't want to gloat. She wanted to know where a duke's daughter had obtained a concentrated feral extract. Such a substance didn't just grow on trees. It required a scholar's hand and a corrupted mind. Stay back, Lizzie, Bramwell warned as he led her down the torchlit corridor. The air is thin down here. Sybil is... she's not herself. The guards say she's been whispering to the walls. I've dealt with whisperers before, Lizzie said, her hand resting on her silver hammer. They reached the final cell. Sybil was sitting on the floor, her sky-blue dress now tattered and stained with dungeon grime. She didn't look up when the iron gate groaned. Her scent was gone, replaced by a strange, metallic smell that made Lizzie's skin crawl. Who gave it to you, Sybil? Lizzie asked, standing before the bars. The extract. Who told you it would work on me? Sybil's head snapped up. Her eyes weren't the icy blue Lizzie remembered. They were pale, almost milky, with thin black veins spidering toward her pupils. She smiled, and it was a wet, unnatural thing. The blacksmith, Sybil croaked. The one who can't hear the song. You think you buried it in the north, don't you? You think a mountain of ice can stop the voice. Lizzie felt a cold chill settle in her stomach. Walter is dead. I watched the keep collapse on him. The brother is dead, Sybil whispered, crawling toward the bars. Her fingers, tipped with blackening nails, gripped the iron. But the hive is not a man. It is a hunger. It found a new path. It found the scholars who were too greedy for power. It found the council. Lizzie recoiled as Sybil let out a high-pitched, discordant hum, the exact same frequency as the hive mind in the northern keep. Bramwell, get the guards! Lizzie shouted. But it was too late. From the shadows of the neighboring cells, the prisoners, actually council loyalists who had been slowly infected over weeks, began to stand. Their eyes were white. Their movements were fluid and wrong. It's inside the city, Lizzie whispered, her heart hammering. The rebellion wasn't about Sybil. It was a distraction. Sybil lunged at the bars, her strength inhuman. The iron groaned and began to bend. The Shadow King will fall, and the scentless one will be the first to bleed. Lizzie pulled her hammer and struck the bars, the silver reacting to the fungal corruption in Sybil's blood. The white sparks blinded the creature, but the sound of the hum was rising from every corner of the dungeon. We have to get to Torsten, Lizzie cried, grabbing Bramwell's arm. Now! Chapter 28. The Silent Coup. The ascent from the dungeons was a frantic blur. Lizzie and Bramwell burst into the palace corridors to find a scene of absolute chaos. The silent coup had begun. It wasn't a roar of soldiers, it was a wave of the song. The dungeon gates hadn't been picked, they had been ripped from the stone by something with more than human strength. Sybil hadn't just escaped, she had been summoned. The palace servants and several lower-ranking guards were wandering the hallways like ghosts, their eyes milky, their voices joined in that low, terrifying hum. The air was thick with a yellow mist, the same vapors from the northern keep, now being pumped through the palace's ventilation shafts. "The healers!" Lizzie gasped, pulling her cloak over her mouth. "Kiva is in the West Wing quarters. If she's trapped—" "We go to the king first," Bramwell insisted, his face pale as he struggled against the pheromonal pressure. "If Torsten falls, the kingdom is lost." "The king is in the Golden Hall with the council," Lizzie retorted, her eyes darting to a group of infected guards blocking the stairs. "Bramwell, listen to me. They're using the mist to paralyze the wolves. I'm the only one who can move through it. You get to the king. I'm getting Kiva and the silver dust. Without that dust, Torsten won't stand a chance." Bramwell hesitated, then nodded. He drew his sword, his eyes watering from the toxins. "Do not die, Holloway. I refuse to be taught how to groom a horse by anyone else." Lizzie didn't wait. She sprinted toward the West Wing, her silver armor acting as a beacon in the dimming light of the palace. She found the infected guards were slow, their reflexes dulled by the hive mind's control. She used her hammer like a battering ram, striking them with a silver-plated head to disrupt their connection to the hum. She burst into her quarters to find Kiva standing on a table, throwing jars of pungent herbs at two milky-eyed servants who were trying to climb over the furniture. "Kiva, down here!" Lizzie yelled, smashing one of the servants aside with a shoulder check. Kiva scrambled down, her satchel overflowing with vials. "Lizzie, it's Osric! I saw him in the gardens with Lord Harkin. He's the one who brought the spores from the north. He's been breeding them in the palace conservatories." "Osric? The scholar?" Lizzie's jaw tightened. "I should have known that worm was behind it. Did you get the concentrated silver dust?" "I have enough for one big burst," Kiva said, her voice trembling. "But we need to get to the ventilation source. If we don't neutralize the spores at the root, the whole city will turn by nightfall." "The king is in the hall," Lizzie said, grabbing Kiva's hand. "We save him first. Then we burn the gardens." Chapter 29. The King in the Mist. The Golden Hall was no longer a place of royalty. It was a theater of the damned. The yellow mist was so thick it looked like a solid wall. Torsten was at the center of the room, on his knees. He had his broadsword driven into the marble floor, using it as a literal crutch to keep himself from collapsing. Lord Harkin and the other council members stood around him, their eyes clear. They were using specialized masks Lizzie hadn't seen before. Beside them stood Osric, holding a silver-bound book and a vial of black liquid. "It is poetic, isn't it, Majesty?" Osric sneered, his voice amplified by the room's acoustics. "The king who would not submit to the north will now submit to his own council. Drink the essence, Torsten. Join the hive, and we shall lead Oakhaven into a new era of silence." Torsten's golden eyes were bloodshot, his skin pale. "Never, you traitorous snake!" "Drink it!" Harkin roared, his voice layered with the hive's discordant hum. The doors to the hall shattered. Lizzie stepped through the smoke, her moonglass armor glowing with a fierce silver light. She didn't look like a smith anymore, she looked like a vengeful spirit of the forge. Beside her, Kiva held two glass spheres aloft. "I think he's had enough to drink, Osric!" Lizzie shouted, her voice cutting through the hum like a thunderclap. She didn't wait for a reply. She sprinted across the hall, the infected guards lunging for her. She ignored them, her eyes fixed on the king. "Kiva, now!" Kiva smashed the spheres at the base of the throne. A massive cloud of purple and silver erupted, the concentrated neutralizing agent reacting violently with the yellow mist. The song, in the room, was instantly silenced, replaced by a series of wet, choking coughs from the council members. Lizzie reached Torsten just as Harkin drew a dagger. She didn't use her hammer, she used her smith-hardened fist, catching the old lord in the jaw with enough force to send his mask flying. "Touch him again, and I'll forge your tongue into a door-knocker," she hissed. She dropped to her knees beside Torsten, grabbing his face. "Torsten, look at me! The sound of the hammer, remember? Clink, clink, clink! Focus on me, you big idiot!" Torsten gasped, his lungs finally pulling in clean air. He looked at Lizzie, his eyes clearing. "Elizabeth, you're late." "I'm exactly on time," she snapped, pulling him to his feet. "Now stand up. We have a scholar to execute and a palace to purge." Chapter 30. The Battle for Oakhaven. The fight in the Golden Hall was brutal. With the song disrupted by Kiva's herbs, the infected guards were confused and sluggish. Torsten, fueled by a primal rage Lizzie had never seen before, moved through the council loyalists like a wolf through a flock of sheep. Bramwell burst into the hall with a dozen uninfected guards, those who had been stationed on the outer walls where the mist hadn't reached. "Secure the council!" Torsten roared, his voice returning to its full, terrifying power. "But leave Osric to me!" The scholar tried to flee toward the secret passages behind the throne, but Lizzie was faster. She threw her hammer. It wasn't a tactical strike, it was a pure, unadulterated throw of a woman who was tired of people threatening her home. The hammer caught Osric in the small of his back, sending him sprawling across the marble. Lizzie was on him in seconds, her boot on his neck. "Where are the remaining spores, Osric? Tell me, or I'll see how much silver dust a human body can tolerate before it turns inside out." The conservatory," Osric wheezed, his eyes bulging. "It's too late. The ventilation is automated." "We'll see about that," Lizzie said, dragging him up by his collar. Torsten walked over, his sword dripping with black ichor. He looked at Lizzie, then at the chaos of his palace. The betrayal of the council was a wound that would never fully heal, but the sight of Lizzie, soot-stained, armored, and utterly dominant, was the only thing keeping him from falling into the blackness. "Elizabeth," he said, his voice soft. "Not now, Torsten," she said, not looking back. "We have to get to the conservatory. Kiva, get the remaining neutralizing salts. We're going to give this palace a deep clean." They moved as a single unit, the king, the smith, and the dormant. As they burst out onto the terrace overlooking the city, they saw the yellow mist beginning to creep over the walls of Oakhaven. The plague wasn't just in the palace anymore, it was descending on the people. Lizzie looked at the sprawling city, then at the silver mark she still held in her hand. The month of service was almost over. Her contract was nearly fulfilled. But as she looked at Torsten, she knew that the real work was only just beginning. "You ready for a long night, my king?" she asked. Torsten gripped his sword and looked out over his kingdom. "As long as I am with you, Elizabeth, the night can last forever." Chapter 31. The Glass Cathedral. The palace conservatory was a towering dome of glass and iron that usually housed exotic flora. Now it was a humid nightmare. The glass was steamed over with a sickly yellow condensation, and the vibrant greens of the palms had been choked out by a pulsing, bioluminescent fungus. It looked like the lungs of a dying beast. "Stay behind me, Kiva," Lizzie commanded, her grip tightening on the soul-weld hammer. The silver plating on the hammer was vibrating, a low hum that answered the rising heat in Lizzie's own blood, which only she could feel. It reacts to the sheer density of the plague spores in the air. Torsten walked beside her, his hand on her shoulder. He was wearing a specialized leather mask Kiva had fashioned, soaked in concentrated neutralizing salts. Even so, his golden eyes were narrowed in focus. Every step was a battle against the alpha hum of the hive. "The source is in the center," Torsten rasped, his voice muffled by the mask. "The hive pulse. I can feel it beating against my own heart. It's trying to sync with me." "It's not going to happen," Lizzie said, her voice sharp and grounding. "We're going to shatter the ventilation fans first. If we don't stop the aerosolized flow, the salts will run out before we reach the city walls." As they moved deeper into the undergrowth, the shadows shifted. These weren't just milky-eyed guards. These were acolytes, shifters who had fully surrendered to the hive. They moved with a terrifying, synchronized grace, their bodies covered in the same black veins that had consumed Sybil. "Lizzie, above you!" Kiva screamed. A mutated acolyte dropped from the iron rafters, its claws extended. Lizzie didn't flinch. She swung the hammer in a rising arc, the silver head catching the creature mid-air. The burst of white sparks was blinding, the silver burning through the fungal corruption instantly. The creature didn't just fall, it disintegrated into a pile of gray ash. "The silver is reacting more violently," Lizzie muttered, wiping a fleck of ash from her silver breastplate. "The plague is more concentrated here. It's unstable." "It's desperate," Torsten added, drawing his broadsword. "It knows the king is here to reclaim his house." They reached the central hub of the conservatory. A massive, iron-grated ventilation system was pumping the yellow mist into the palace's ductwork. At the center of the hub sat the hive pulse, a literal heart made of fungus, 5 feet tall, pulsing with a discordant, wet thudding. "There it is," Lizzie said, her eyes narrowing. "The heart of the rot. Kiva, get the neutralizing salts ready. We're going to blow this thing into the next century." Chapter 32. The White Shadow. The palace conservatory was a cathedral of suffocating heat. To Lizzie, the air didn't smell of rot. It felt like it. The atmosphere was thick and oily, coating her tongue with a metallic taste that made her want to gag. The glass dome above was obscured by a film of yellow condensation, trapping them inside a humid nightmare. In the center of the overgrowth stood Lady Sybil. She was no longer human. She was a towering monstrosity of gray, translucent skin and pulsing black veins. She didn't move like a person. She jerked and twitched, her joints popping with a wet, sickening sound that echoed off the glass. "The king." Sybil's voice was a distorted rasp, vibrating in the floorboards beneath Lizzie's boots. "Kneeling. As he should." Torsten was on the ground. Seeing him like that felt like a physical blow to Lizzie's chest. The man who was usually a mountain of granite and unyielding steel was trembling. He had his broadsword planted in the earth, using it to hold himself upright, but his head hung low. The yellow mist swirling around his ankles was poison to him, a chemical weapon designed to turn his own biology against him. Lizzie could see the veins in his neck bulging as he fought a silent, agonizing war to keep his inner wolf leashed. If he shifted now, amidst this toxicity, he would be lost to the madness forever. "Get up, Torsten," Lizzie whispered, her voice cracking. "Please, just get up." He lifted his head. His golden eyes were bloodshot, swimming with pain. He looked at her, and for the first time, Lizzie saw fear. Not for himself, but for her. "Run," he mouthed. The word was soundless, lost in the overwhelming, rhythmic thrum-thrum-thrum of the feral pulse beating in the center of the room. Sybil lunged. She moved with terrifying speed for something so large. Torsten tried to raise his sword, but his arm was heavy, his reflexes dulled by the poison. Sybil's clawed hand backhanded him, sending the King of Oakhaven skidding across the mossy stones. He hit a pillar with a bone-jarring crunch and didn't rise. "No!" The scream tore from Lizzie's throat, raw and burning. She sprinted forward, grabbing her hammer from the ground, but before she could swing, the air pressure in the room spiked. It hit her like a wall, a wave of psychic noise that rattled her teeth. Sybil turned her milky, soulless gaze upon the smith. "The void," Sybil hissed, looming over her. "Empty, broken, useless." She raised a massive clawed fist to crush Lizzie into the earth. Lizzie squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the impact. She felt the heat of the monster's proximity, a feverish radiation that prickled her skin. Empty. Was she? For 10 years, the world had told her that lacking a scent meant she lacked a soul, that she was a hollow vessel. But as the darkness threatened to crush her, Lizzie felt a spark in the center of her chest. It wasn't the warm, orange glow of a forge. It was white. It was cold. It was the searing, blinding brilliance of a star born in the vacuum of space. The void wasn't empty. The void was where the light was kept. The heat inside her surged, agonizing and exquisite. It felt as if her bones were melting and reforming in the span of a heartbeat. She didn't reach for her hammer. She threw her head back and let out a sound that wasn't human, a howl that carried the frequency of breaking glass. Crack! A blinding explosion of pearlescent light erupted from her skin. It was so bright it washed out the colors of the room, turning the yellow mist into nothingness. The physical sensation of the shift was a rush of pure adrenaline and power. When the light dimmed, the woman was gone. Standing in her place was a creature of legend. She was a white shadow. Her fur was not simply white. It shimmered with a mercurial liquid glow, like moonlight trapped in silk. She was sleek, lethal, and radiating a cold, purifying energy that made the air around her crackle with static. Sybil shrieked, shielding her eyes. The light physically burned the fungal corruption on her skin, sizzling like water on a hot pan. But the white wolf didn't attack. She turned. She bounded toward Torsten. He was still slumped against the pillar, his eyes wide with shock. He watched the glowing beast approach, bracing for an attack, but the white wolf slowed. She circled him. As she completed the circle, the air inside changed. The heavy, oily pressure of the hive vanished. The yellow mist evaporated, pushed back by the barrier of her radiance. She created a sanctuary of pure, clean air. The white wolf lowered her massive head, pressing her cold, wet nose against Torsten's feverish cheek. The touch was grounding, electric. "I am here," her presence seemed to say, not in words, but in a wave of calm. "The air is clean. You are safe with me. Let him out." Torsten stared into her eyes, pools of molten silver. He felt the pain in his skull recede, replaced by the intoxicating proximity of her spirit. She was his anchor. She was the only place in the world where he could be free. A low, vibrating rumble started in Torsten's chest. It grew louder, a sound of absolute dominance that made the remaining glass in the ceiling tremble. He didn't fight it anymore. He surrendered to it. Torsten threw his head back and roared. His body contorted, expanding, muscle and bone reshaping with violent grace. A whirlwind of darkness erupted from him, a sharp contrast to Lizzie's light. When he landed on 4 paws, the ground shook. He was the Shadow King. A massive, midnight black wolf, easily twice the size of a normal alpha. His fur was as dark as the void between stars, absorbing the light around him, and his eyes burned like twin suns. The visual was breathtaking. The black wolf and the white wolf, obsidian and diamond, night and day. They stood shoulder to shoulder, their fur brushing. The static charge between them raised the hair on Lizzie's neck. It was a perfect, terrifying balance. The black wolf looked at Sybil and snarled, a sound of pure, predatory malice. Sybil stumbled back, genuine terror etched on her mutated face. "Two! There are 2!" They moved as one. Torsten launched himself first. He was a battering ram of shadow, hitting Sybil with the force of a falling boulder. His massive jaws locked onto her shoulder, his bite force shattering bone with a sickening snap. Sybil howled and swung her other arm, claws raking toward Torsten's flank. Lizzie was faster. She was a streak of starlight. She leaped over Torsten's back, her body twisting in the air. She slashed her claws across Sybil's face. Her touch didn't just cut, it purified. White fire traced the wounds, burning the corruption out of the flesh. Sybil screamed, thrashing wildly. Torsten held her pinned, his black paws digging into the stone, an immovable object. He absorbed the blows meant for Lizzie, his thick coat and massive muscle absorbing the impact, while Lizzie danced around the periphery, striking with surgical precision. He was the shield, she was the sword. With a final, coordinated movement, Torsten released Sybil's shoulder and lunged for her legs, dragging the behemoth to the ground. As Sybil fell, exposing her throat, Lizzie descended. She bit down. A flash of blinding white light pulsed from her jaws, surging through Sybil's corrupted veins. The monster disintegrated, dissolving into a pile of harmless gray ash. Silence fell over the conservatory. The black wolf stood panting, his chest heaving like a bellows. He turned his massive head toward Lizzie. The rage in his golden eyes faded, replaced by a profound, adoring softness. He took a step toward her. He lowered his head and gently, reverently, licked the side of her face, cleaning a speck of ash from her glowing white fur. Lizzie leaned into him, resting her head against his powerful neck. She could feel the thunderous beat of his heart against her ribs. She couldn't smell him, but she could feel the heat radiating from his massive body, a warmth that chased away the cold of the void forever. In this form, without words, without titles, they were simply two halves of the same soul, finally whole. Chapter 33. The Heart of the Rot. The transition from the White Shadow back to Elizabeth Halloway was a physical shock, like plunging from a warm bath into a frozen lake. The mercurial light that had consumed her body flickered and died, leaving Lizzie gasping on the cold stone floor of the conservatory. Her skin felt raw and overly sensitive, tingling with the aftershocks of the immense energy she had just channeled. Elizabeth. Torsten's voice was ragged, stripped of its usual royal command. He rushed to her side, his heavy boots skidding on the mossy stones. He discarded his leather mask, letting it clatter to the ground. The air in the conservatory was no longer heavy and oily. It was crisp, tasting of ozone and shattered ice. The yellow mist had been neutralized by the mere presence of the White Shadow, leaving the space aggressively clear. Torsten caught her before she could collapse completely. His hands were large and warm, his grip firm against her trembling arms. She couldn't smell him. She never could. But she could feel the frantic, thunderous rhythm of his heart beating against her chest as he pulled her close. It was a drumbeat of survival. I told you I was built differently, Lizzie wheezed, a weak, tired smirk playing on her lips. She tried to stand, but her knees felt like water. She leaned heavily into him, letting his strength become hers. Her gaze drifted past him to the center of the room. The hive pulse was still there. The fungal heart was no longer shrouded in mist, but it was beating frantically, a wet, erratic thud, thud, thud that Lizzie could feel vibrating through the soles of her boots. It was the vibration of a parasite realizing its host was fighting back. "Finish it, Torsten," she whispered, gripping the front of his tunic. "Smash that thing before it finds another frequency. End the song." Torsten didn't hesitate. He gently set her down against a pillar and stood up. He retrieved his broadsword, the black steel now glowing with a faint, residual pearlescent shimmer from its contact with Lizzie's wolf form. He didn't look like a king in a court painting, he looked like a god of war carved from obsidian. He walked toward the pulsing heart. He didn't just swing, he roared, pouring every ounce of his apex power and months of suppressed rage into the strike. Crack! The sound was deafening, like a lightning strike in a canyon. The sword sliced through the fungal heart, severing it from the iron ventilation grate. A geyser of black ichor erupted, splattering the floor, followed immediately by a shockwave of psychic energy. It wasn't a sound, but a pressure, a final, agonizing shriek that knocked the remaining glass panes from the conservatory's iron ribs. Shards of glass rained down like diamonds, tinkling musically against the stone. Then, silence. Absolute, heavy silence. The vibration in the floor stopped. The oppressive heat vanished. Outside, the yellow mist that had begun to creep over the city walls evaporated in the morning sun, dissolving like a bad dream. Thousands of citizens and guards blinked, shaking their heads as their minds returned to them. The song of the hive replaced by the chirping of birds and the wind in the trees. "It's over," Kiva whispered. She was sitting on the floor amongst the gray ash of what used to be Sybil, clutching her satchel. Her face was pale, but her eyes were bright with tears. "The hive is gone." Torsten dropped his sword. He didn't care about the weapon. He turned back to Lizzie, falling to his knees before her. He gathered her into his arms, burying his face in the crook of her neck. Lizzie closed her eyes, overwhelmed by the sensory details of him, the scratch of his stubble against her skin, the intense heat radiating from his core, the way his chest heaved with relief. She couldn't smell the wood smoke and iron that others talked about, but she knew his texture. She knew his weight. She knew the way his hands trembled slightly as they held her, as if checking to make sure she was real. "The contract," she murmured, her voice fading as exhaustion finally claimed her. She traced the line of his jaw with a soot-stained finger. "Torsten, how many days are left?" Torsten pulled back just enough to look at her. His golden eyes were clear, shining with a devotion that made her breath hitch. He kissed her forehead, a soft, lingering pressure. "None," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "The debt is paid, Elizabeth Halloway. You are no longer my outrider." "Good," she said, her eyes fluttering closed, a profound peace settling over her. "Then you can pay me for the overtime." Torsten laughed, a choked, watery sound, and gathered her tighter against his chest. He looked out through the shattered dome at his kingdom. It was scarred, and the council was in ruins, but they were free. And as he held the woman who had become his light, he knew that he would never have to lead in silence again. Chapter 34. The Royal Reckoning. The week following the fall of the hive was a whirlwind of fire, silver, and reconstruction. The palace, once a place of suffocating perfumes and hushed whispers, was now filled with the sounds of industry. Hammers rang against stone, glass was swept away, and the air scrubbers hummed with a clean, rhythmic efficiency. Torsten didn't wait for the High Council to regroup. He was a man possessed by a need for justice. With Lizzie and Bramwell at his side, he systematically purged the palace of every traitor who had whispered to the spores. Lord Harkin was found trying to flee the city gates in a carriage weighed down with gold bars. He didn't get far. The reckoning took place in the courtyard, beneath the midday sun. Torsten didn't execute him. He did something far worse. He stripped Harkin of his title using the ancient rite of exile. Lizzie watched from the balcony, her arms crossed over her chest. She saw Harkin kneeling, stripped of his fine silks, shivering in a simple, rough-spun tunic. Torsten stepped forward, placing his hand on Harkin's shoulder. He didn't speak a curse, he simply withdrew his protection. To the onlookers, nothing changed visually, but Lizzie saw Harkin slump, as if a vital string holding him upright had been cut. His wolf spirit, bound to the packlands, was severed. He was sentenced to live the rest of his days as a dormant, the very class of wolf he had despised and oppressed. "You're being vindictive," Lizzie noted later that afternoon. She was sitting on the edge of the king's massive oak desk in the solar, swinging her legs. She was no longer wearing her battered leathers. She was dressed in a tunic of charcoal silk that felt like water against her skin, though she still had her favorite silver hammer tucked into a custom belt loop. Old habits died hard. "I am being a king who protects his own," Torsten replied. He was standing by the window, looking up from a map of the Western Marches. The sunlight caught the sharp angles of his face, softening the war weariness that usually lived there. "Harkin sought to turn my people into puppets. Exile is a mercy. He will live, but he will never hear the pack song again." He stood up and walked over to her. The solar was warm, bathed in golden light that highlighted the dust motes dancing in the air. Torsten stepped between her knees, his presence encompassing her. It was no longer suffocating. It was comforting, like standing near a well-stoked hearth in the middle of winter. "The city is recovering, Elizabeth," he said softly, his hands resting on her thighs. "The healers say the moonglass silver you provided is working miracles on those who were infected. You have saved my people twice over." "I did it for the silver mark," she teased, though her expression softened. She reached out to straighten the collar of his tunic, enjoying the tactile contrast between the soft fabric and the hard muscle beneath. "And because I hate leaving a job half-finished." "And what of your own secret?" Torsten asked, his voice dropping to a low rumble that Lizzie felt in her stomach. "The white shadow. The court is already whispering. They don't see you as a defect anymore. They look at you with awe. They call you a saint." "I'm no saint," Lizzie scoffed, rolling her eyes. "I'm a smith. I just happen to have a lot of repressed light and a very bad temper. I don't want a throne, Torsten. I don't want people bowing to me. I want a forge where I can work in peace, and a horse that doesn't need grooming every 5 minutes because its owner is a show-off." Torsten laughed, the sound vibrating through his chest and into hers. "I've already commissioned a new forge in the palace gardens. The best bellows, the hottest coals, and all the refined silver you can melt. But you won't be working in peace. You'll be working as my consort." "Consort?" Lizzie raised an eyebrow, feigning annoyance. "Is that another word for indentured servant?" "It's another word for the woman who tells the king he's being a brat," he whispered, leaning down until his lips were inches from hers. It's a title for the only person who holds the king's leash. Lizzie looked at him. She saw the raw vulnerability in his eyes. The man who had been alone for centuries, finally finding his equal. The heat between them spiked, electric and undeniable. "Well," she whispered, grabbing the front of his tunic and pulling him down. "If the job comes with dental benefits and a new hammer, I might consider it." The kiss was slow and intoxicating, tasting of promise and victory. It wasn't the desperate collision of survival they had shared in the snow. This was deliberate. It was acclaiming. As Lizzie felt his hands slide up her waist and the vibration of his content growl against her lips, she realized she wasn't a void. She was full. She was exactly where she was meant to be, held by the darkness that loved her light. Chapter 35. The Silver Union. The story of the scentless smith and the Shadow King didn't just fade into history. It became a legend told around every hearth in the 7 territories. But for Lizzie and Torsten, it wasn't a legend. It was simply the beginning of their life. The Silver Union wasn't held in the opulent Golden Hall with its stifling perfumes and judgmental portraits. It was held in the beautifully restored conservatory. The glass domes had been repaired, gleaming under the afternoon sun, and the rot had been replaced with rows of white mountain roses and resilient pines. Lizzie refused to wear a veil or a silk gown. She walked down the aisle wearing her moonglass armor. The silver plates had been polished until they shone like mirrors, and with every step she took, the armor made a soft, melodic clink, 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 the music of her trade. It was a statement. She was a warrior, a smith, and a queen, and she would not hide any part of herself. Kiva stood as her maid of honor, looking regal in emerald green, the silver dagger Lizzie had forged for her gleaming proudly at her hip. She was no longer just a dormant. She was the royal apothecary, respected by all. Beside her stood Bramwell, Torsten's best man, who was grinning so widely it looked painful. Torsten waited for her at the altar. He wore his crown, but his eyes were fixed solely on Lizzie. As she reached him, the air between them seemed to hum with static electricity. He took her hands, rough, calloused, and strong, in his own. The high priest began the ceremony, but when it came time for the rings, Torsten shook his head. He reached into his pocket and pulled out something else. It was a simple leather cord, strung with a single, battered silver coin. Lizzie's breath hitched. It was the mark, the exact coin she had flicked at his chest in the mud of the Frosthook outpost. The coin that had started a war, ended a plague, and bought a king's heart. "I believe this belongs to you," Torsten said, his voice rough with emotion. He stepped closer, fastening the cord around her neck. The cool metal settled against her skin, right over her heart. "It was the first time anyone saw me as a man. It is the most valuable thing I own." Lizzie looked down at the coin, running her thumb over the dented edge. She looked up at the man who had become her world. She felt the warmth of the sun filtering through the glass, the vibration of the crowd's anticipation, and the steady, grounding presence of her mate. "Keep it, stable boy," she whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of laughter and tears. "Consider it a down payment on the next 50 years. I expect excellent service." The crowd erupted in cheers, a roar of approval that Lizzie felt deep in her bones. It wasn't just a marriage, it was a soul bond that bridged the gap between the scent and the void. That night, the celebrations spilled out into the gardens. The moon rose full and white over Oakhaven, casting a silver glow over the city. Lizzie and Torsten slipped away to the balcony of the West Wing, seeking a moment of quiet. The air was clear and crisp. The song of the hive was a distant memory, replaced by the laughter of their people. Lizzie leaned against the stone railing, looking out at the horizon. Torsten moved behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. She leaned back into him, closing her eyes. She focused on the sensations, the rough texture of the stone under her hands, the cool night breeze on her face, the overwhelming, furnace-like heat of Torsten's body encompassing hers. "I love you, Elizabeth," Torsten whispered into the night. Lizzie smiled. She didn't need to smell the pine or the pheromones to know it was true. She could feel it in the way he held her, as if she were the anchor that kept him from drifting away. "I know," she said softly, placing her hand over his. I can feel it. And as the king laughed, a low rumble against her back, the white shadow smiled. The silver of her spirit reflected the moon, shining bright in a kingdom that would never be dark again. Bonus Epilogue: The Price of a Crown. The royal forge was no longer a dark, soot-stained secret. It was a sprawling, airy pavilion of marble and iron, situated at the heart of the Oakhaven Gardens. The rhythmic clink, clink, clink of a hammer echoed through the roses, but today the sound was lighter, almost playful. Elizabeth, Queen of Oakhaven, the White Shadow, and still the most formidable silversmith in the 7 territories, wiped a smudge of charcoal from her forehead. She was hunched over a small anvil, finishing the delicate scrollwork on a silver rattle. It's lopsided, a deep, amused voice rumbled from the doorway. Lizzie didn't look up. She didn't have to. The essence reached her before he did, that visceral, grounding blend of iron, wood smoke, and the crisp ozone of the Highland peaks. It was an essence she now cherished more than the light itself. It's not lopsided, Torsten. It's ergonomic, Lizzie countered, finally set down her hammer. She turned to see her king leaning against the doorframe. He wasn't wearing his crown or his heavy royal furs. He was in a simple linen tunic, his hair windblown from a morning ride. And shouldn't you be in the council chamber discussing tax rebates for the southern miners? I told them the king was busy with a high-priority structural inspection, Torsten said, walking toward her. He wrapped his massive arms around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, inhaling deeply. You smell like charcoal and cinnamon today. It's distracting. I'm a busy woman, stable boy. I don't have time to be your olfactory entertainment, she teased, though she leaned her head back against his shoulder, closing her eyes. The peace between them was a living thing, forged in the fires of the hive and tempered by a year of reconstruction. The kingdom was thriving. The feral plague was a story told to frighten children, and the High Council had been replaced by a body of alphas, omegas, and dormants who actually cared about the land. Torsten reached out and picked up the silver rattle. His large fingers looked absurdly powerful against the delicate toy. Is it finished? Almost, Lizzie whispered. She turned in his arms, her gaze softening as she looked at his face. Kiva says the little one will be here by the spring thaw. She also says if I don't stop lifting heavy ingots, she's going to start putting sleeping drafts in my tea. Torsten's expression shifted, his golden eyes glowing with a fierce, protective tenderness. He placed his hand over Lizzie's stomach, his alpha hum dropping to a low, soothing purr that vibrated through her entire body. Kiva is a wise woman. You should listen to her. I listen to no one, and you know it, Lizzie snapped, though she covered his hand with her own. Torsten smiled, that slow, private smirk that was reserved only for her. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a worn, battered silver mark, the original coin. He had finally had it mounted onto a simple leather cord. He looped it around her neck, the silver resting against her heart. What's this for? She asked, looking down at it. The month of service ended a long time ago. It's a reminder, Torsten whispered, leaning down until their foreheads touched, that the greatest king in the world was once bought for a single silver coin by a woman who was too stubborn to be afraid. It's the best bargain I ever made. Lizzie reached up, grabbing the front of his tunic and pulling him into a kiss that tasted of forever. Technically, she muttered against his lips, you still owe me for the braids you put in Ironhoof's mane. I haven't forgotten the interest. Torsten laughed, a rich, booming sound that filled the forge and drifted out over the kingdom they had saved together. I'll spend the rest of my life paying you back, Elizabeth. I promise. And as the sun climbed higher over Oakhaven, the White Shadow and the Shadow King stood together in the heat of the forge, knowing that no matter what storms the future held, their bond was made of the only thing that truly lasted: silver, grit, and a love that never needed a cent to be found. The end.